welcome back, everybody. It's a really important day on the Nonprofit Show because it's Nonprofit Power Week with our friends at Your Part-Time Controller. And today we have Barbara Enright. She's a director with us, or with YPTC, joining us. And she's going to give us the questions that we should be asking our finance team. Wow, Barbara, there are a lot of questions, aren't there?
Yes, there definitely are.
Well, we're delighted to have you with us. You know, we don't do nonprofit power weeks very often. They're very rare. And when we do them, it's a big deal because we take a topic and we run with it for 5 days straight. And so this week, it's all about finance and how we need to be thinking about our accounting, our finance, our revenue, and it's been super interesting. Really, I've learned a lot. Barbara, no pressure that you come in on Wednesday, but this will be really fabulous. We get to have these conversations because we have amazing presenting sponsors. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Third Sector Company, Your Part-Time Controller, and Martis, one of our newest partners. I'm Julia C. Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. And Barbara Enright, talk to us about being a director with YPTC and where you are coming to us from.
Sure. So I'm a director and market leader here at YPTC, and I lead our Dallas-Fort Worth market. So I'm kind of in charge of all of our fabulous nonprofit accounting experts and making sure that we're keeping clients happy and that they are, we're meeting all their financial needs and helping them increase their mission.
Right. I love it. So you were telling me in the green room that this part of Texas has really only been flourishing for 3 years. It's relatively new, correct?
That's right. We started in Houston. And so I was saying that's even where I was hired out of. And then we've had our Dallas-Fort Worth market here about 3 years.
Wow, amazing. Well, it's just great to have you on. We have such wonderful relationships with all of the leadership across this country when it comes to YPTC. It seems like all of you have your own unique personalities and traits and talents, and yet you all row in the same direction, which I think is remarkable given the size of your organization and how you're growing. And I guess what's really remarkable about this is that this allows you to see a lot, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so when we had the opportunity to talk to you about what are those questions that leaders should be asking their finance teams, we jumped on this. And the first one that you advised us on, it actually gives me the chills right now. Do you trust the numbers? I'm like, well, yeah, the numbers show up on a piece of paper. Of course you trust them. And then when I was, preparing for this, I'm like, oh man, I've never asked that question. I just assumed that those numbers were right. Talk me off a ledge here, Barbara, because I'm shocked by this.
Sure. Well, this is obviously a difficult question to ask sometimes because you're worried about offending people or getting anyone upset. But it is an important question to ask. And really, when you're asking, do we trust the numbers? What you're really asking is, are these complete? Are they final? Are they accurate?
Okay.
And so a lot of times the numbers are correct, but they're preliminary. And so what we're really waiting on is, oh, we still need one more reconciliation to do, or we're waiting on this report from the other department, or it's end of year statements things we're making. And so the numbers are correct, but they're preliminary in that case.
So Deanna Peterson was on Monday, and she gave us a really interesting tip, and that was to not have your board meetings right at the beginning of the month because the finance team hasn't had a chance to reconcile everything. And she was talking to us about you're going to get better information if you go 2-3 weeks into the month. Do you think that's a good strategy as well to get that veracity up?
That's absolutely accurate. Unless you are a tiny organization, you have, a few transactions a month and that's it, we can close you quickly. But having the time to reconcile, we need to talk to the development team, talk to the programs team, make sure all the numbers are together, and that just takes time.
Yeah, really interesting. I just thought of something when you were walking through the reasons why we should be thinking about this. I don't know how often I've sat on a board and seen or heard the word preliminary. These are the preliminary numbers. Is that just my failing, or do you think that this is something that we don't recognize, or we don't use that vocabulary?
I think it's something we don't often use. Typically, we're closing the month, and so the month is as accurate as it can be. But the time I typically use preliminary law is the end of year numbers. Yeah, I worked with one organization actually that, we gave them preliminary numbers from board meeting, and then we made all of our year-end adjustments. And one of the things was looking at whether the pledges were still collectible. And we ended up, a huge pledge was no longer collectible, and what looked like a surplus turned into a deficit. And so I was very glad that we had told the board, these are preliminary numbers.
Yeah, and I think what you just said is such a great, piece of, can we trust these numbers? That's really sage advice, because if you can kind of buffer what could be, you can plan for it, right? But that, to have that shock when the revenue difference, oi, I'm glad I'm not on that board. Sorry.
Yeah, it was not a pleasant conversation.
Okay, so we're like looking at the veracity of the numbers, feeling confident that we do have the right numbers so we can make the right decisions. I love this next question that you're advising us to ask, and that is, what do I need to know right now? Like, this is really interesting, Barbara. Talk to us about this.
Yeah, this is actually my favorite question. I know we're not supposed to have favorites, but it is one of my favorites here. Because I think so often accountants, especially, we can get sucked into the numbers and just be staring at all these numbers. And a board can help the finance team take a step back and really look at what's the most important thing I need to know right now. It's great to talk about the variances and all those little differences, but if you're running out of cash, the board needs to know.
It's an interesting thing because it seems like it can help light a fire to the conversation for the rest of the meeting.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important. I love, at YPTC, we always include a memo with our financials, and that executive summary is just the most important part. It's the thing I hear from boards all the time. Thank you for putting this in here. I can read those 2 or 3 sentences and I know, are we doing well? Are we doing poorly? What do we need to be concerned with? Get that big picture of what's really important right now.
Yeah. It's a fascinating thing because we were talking in the green room. I'm always, even in my own life, trying to use that 10-10-10 rule. What decision or what action do I need to take? And I break it down into the next 10 weeks, 10 months, and 10 years. And when you look at a situation and then you use that lens, your response is generally different, right? For each of those time frames. And so I think it kind of helps to say what needs to bubble up to the front so that you are doing the right thing and you're being the best steward of the organization that you can be. And again, this is a really interesting question, because I would imagine that 90% of the time this gets asked, the finance folks have a different answer than what maybe leadership has. Is that possibly true?
Yes, absolutely. Leadership has so many other things they're thinking about. Same as development, all the different answers and programs, but finance is really looking at the financial health of the organization. And so, while that is still mission aligned, they may have other concerns in there as well.
Yeah, really an important question. And I again, one of those things that I had never thought about. And I'm like, wow, there's so many times over the trajectory of my board service, I wished I had asked that question. I wish that I had even thought to ask that question, right? Okay, so then you've got the down and the dirty and what's going on and what do I need to know right now? The numbers are right. The numbers are still in translation. What the next question is, again, fascinating. What are we expecting next? What's coming down the road? I don't want to wait until the next board meeting to have a disaster or have never thought about something that needs to be acted upon. Talk to us about this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times you'll find finance folks were kind of obsessed with the numbers in the past or looking at what happened in the past and not thinking about what's going to happen in the future. And so that's where forecasting, projecting, scenario planning, all of that can come in. And that's so
Yeah.
important, especially right now when we're having, times of uncertainty. We need to be able to plan ahead and know how we can pivot in the future depending on what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. That scenario planning, I love that you brought that up. So you have those tools in your toolkit. When you ask that question, what's up next? Is that the time when you pull that out and say, we've planned for this? Or is this the time that you create those scenario plans?
It should have already been planned, hopefully ahead as we get in there. Some situations, especially if it's a time of flux, we really need scenario planning when it comes to, funding and things like that going on. I heard someone once say they do it blue sky, gray sky, dark sky scenario planning, which I really liked, and I've used that a lot.
I love it. I totally love it. And I think that's brilliant. That's just brilliant. I love that you gave us that idea because again, it's a framework. And that's always been kind of one of my challenges with scenario planning, because it's like, well, wait a minute, there's a bajillion things that could happen, but if you kind of break it into smaller pieces like that, it makes it a lot more manageable, doesn't it?
Yeah, so if the development team is saying, hey, we applied for all these grants, there's, $1 million out there. Well, you can blue sky plan, great, we got a whole $1 million, or we got nothing. What do we do then? Or maybe it's somewhere in the middle, which is probably most realistic.
Right. I love that. That's brilliant. That might be the best thing I've learned today from you. I'm fascinated by that. Let me ask you a little bit deeper question. A lot of times organizations, and they generally are larger organizations, they'll have robust um, finance committees or people that serve the executive committee, that are more, educated and more capable of working with a finance department, understanding, asking these questions. Um, but I'm thinking that these questions are not just for those folks, that they're really for everybody. Can you kind of give me your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is really important. And I think that's why kind of breaking it down to these simple questions helps for people when, they may not have a finance background. We work with a lot of associations, and so we might be working with a whole group of firefighters or a whole group of doctors. They don't have any financial background, but they can still ask what's going to happen next. Are the numbers right? Can we trust them? Those are really simple questions that anybody on a board and a finance committee can and should be asking.
It also makes it seem to me that maybe a tact would be that the finance person representing the organization or doing this work would say, here are the questions we need to be asking, like lead the board or the team, or if it's the leadership team, into even beginning to think about these questions, right?
Yes, absolutely. Especially when it comes to kind of the forecasting piece, that's just not something everyone always thinks about. A lot of boards, well, it's a check the box, great, we got financials, we approve. But if you have a robust finance team, they should be coming in and saying, hey, here are the things we're thinking about next. Here's our forecast. We had this budget, it was great, it was the best we knew what to do with it at the time, but now we're getting into inflation just happened or COVID happened, something happened and that the numbers change for what we're projecting. And so being able to look into that as well as work across teams is really important for projecting to talk to the development team, talk to the programs team, talking to leadership, making sure you're getting all the input, all the variables that you can have the best guess of what's coming up.
Right. So the next question is a fascinating one because I feel like this is where a lot of tension occurs between a board who doesn't really understand the concept of what can we use these funds for. And it boils down to restricted versus unrestricted funding, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And like you said, a lot of boards don't always understand, and especially a lot of people serving on nonprofit boards don't have a nonprofit background. They're coming in with cash is cash, everything's fine. And so, being able to explain, that's great, we have this $1 million that we got, but we can only use it for this specific program in this specific way on these specific salaries. And so it's really important to be saying what's our unrestricted money and what's our restrictions.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's got to be one of those things that the finance department, when they're coming in to work with their board or committees, they have to revisit the definition of this and the process of this, because it seems to me that I hear all the time from finance teams about how screwed up things get over this very issue. Because to your point, people are like, wait a minute, we got all this money in. How could that be? And then, to have to make these adjustments can be, I think this is one of those things that makes it, Barbara, why people fight or have stress within their own organization with the finance department, because even the employees don't understand this.
Absolutely. Well, and this, especially talking about restricted funding, it so closely involves development and finance and programs. And as you know, oftentimes they're not talking to each other. And that's where the breakdown happens. We came into an organization and they said, oh my gosh, we have all these grant reports due. Please help us, please help us. And we went in and they over restricted their funds so much that they put down specific people's names for the salaries, which of course, over the year, people moved on, people moved to different positions. And so we had to go back to the funders, submit budget adjustments, all of that before we could even release the restrictions. And so again, having finance involved at that beginning part with development, but then also in the after to help with programs, have we spent this? What did we spend it on? It's really, really critical.
It's an interesting thing because I feel like when we're talking about development, the pressure to for cause selling, and I don't think selling is a bad word here. I want to make sure that I'm very clear on that. But we sell to get funding, right? We sell ourselves, we sell a program, we sell trust, we sell, this philanthropic relationship. And I think it's really easy to sell an idea and a concept that says your money is going to go help us do da 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 da, right? But the reality is we need funding for things that aren't sexy, things that aren't grand, but that keep us going. And so I can see how this happens, right? I can see the struggle, and it's a tough thing. It's a really tough thing.
It is. And development teams are wonderful at what they do. I could never do it. But when they're out there selling this specific program in a really, really specific way, sometimes it makes it hard. The organization can't succeed if it doesn't also have an executive director and an accountant and, legal, all the various things that we need just to actually really run the program and keep serving the people that we're serving.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting conversation that we need to have even more, and to really understand how we look at restricted versus unrestricted funding. And I think it was somebody from YPTC who several months ago, we were talking and they said, when you design your year-end asks, maybe it's a digital campaign or maybe it's snail mail, and you're like, $50 will buy 3 backpacks, $150 will buy 100 pencils or whatever it is. Technically, if you're posting that up that way, any funds that you get should need to go there. And even a lot of organizations don't realize that. They're like, oh, wait, yeah, if that's how we've put forth and we've marketed ourselves. And that just blew me away.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes, it's just the advertising. It doesn't have to be a complicated grant that puts, things into restrictions. Like you said, some organizations I've seen, you go to their donation page and you have, 5 options to choose from. But if you instead make it, well, hey, only if you're wanting to restrict it, let's just, these can go to general operating, they can help the whole thing. They're almost enticing people to restrict their money.
Yeah. And I would say as a donor, when I look at that, there's always that, what's my money going to do? And I think when we have these super donors, that has made things even more. It's more imperative. That person's like, I only am going to get $50. What's $50 going to do? But when I see those things, I'm like, wow, well, $50 can go pretty far. I should stretch it to 150 because it goes that much further. but tying it back to being a restriction it's a fascinating issue. So asking that question, super, super important. One of the big questions that nobody wants to really ask or even understand, are we ready for the audit? Oh, what does that mean?
Yeah, so this is a really important question to ask. You don't want to go into an audit if you're not ready, obviously. You always want to come out with your unmodified or clean opinion. Where I see this is not only organizations that have their audit every year, but okay, what else do we need to gather? What documentation, or are we missing something from development? What are the extra things we need? But this question becomes even more important when an organization is going for their very first audit. We
Okay.
come across that a lot with our organizations, and sometimes we can say, yes, the numbers are right, we have all the documentation, but for the last year, you've had a single person who is in charge of all cash receipts, and there's no controls in place. So we're going to end up with internal control deficiencies.
Interesting. Okay, so technically, when do we start asking this? I mean, if we're working with a finance department as a leader of an organization or a board member, committee member, when does this question get asked? I mean, like right before the audit or at a certain time of year, like how should, or the beginning of the year, how should we be thinking about this?
It really should, at least a few months before the audit. Usually when you're, signing your new engagement letter with your auditor, you should be asking, what's our timeline? What do we need? Typically, we need a couple months to get everything, in, or do we have some other items that are outstanding that it might take us longer to get there? Because you're really hoping, best practice to have your audit completed within 6 months after year end.
Okay. Okay. Good advice. That kind of helps level set that process. Because again, what you just said was very interesting to me. Especially if you're new to the audit process, you've grown your organization, backing it up. Talk to us a little bit about the control piece, because it's not just the numbers, right? The management of numbers.
Exactly. Yeah. It's so much about controls. Like I mentioned, one person being in charge of all the cash receipts can be a problem.
Yeah.
But similarly, even sometimes just your documentation, if for your program you're not collecting all the receipts, that can be an issue. So it's really relying on everybody making sure we're following, the same internal controls, having the right policies in place as well.
Mhm. Right. And so again, that's going to be somewhat of a new concept for for some of these organizations. Because if you can share with us a little bit about some of the policies that you're asked about, that you might say, wow, that doesn't even relate to finance or accounting, but talk to us about those policies.
Sure, yeah, they're looking at not only financial policies, but also what are board policies? Do we have an investment policy? All of those, and then as well as just some of your internal controls and the processes around how you're delivering your program can come in there as well.
Yeah, really interesting. And I feel like those questions are going to actually be increased with IT issues, data privacy, and certainly AI.
Absolutely, yeah. We're seeing more and more need to show the cybersecurity insurance, things like that. And again, by just asking, are we ready for the audit? You're going to find out. Finance teams typically know, what's going wrong, what are we missing, what's in there, and so, especially if you're coming up to thinking about doing your first audit, you can never ask the question too early.
Right. So a lot of these audit partners, they're going to give you a list of things that they want, correct? In
Yeah.
advance. So you should have, it shouldn't be just a blind situation. You should have something pretty well in advance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know what to expect roughly. You're giving them the numbers, and then they come back with samples. So they're asking for, okay, can we have, this grant, and this grant documentation. But if you're following best practice, having the policies, finance should have that right there. They should have the receipt of the cash coming in. Have any information on the restrictions. That should all be right there. For with the finance team, so they can jump in and supply that.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, this has been a great conversation, and something, Barbara, I sadly had never thought about. I think that many board members, when the finance reports are given or the finance team comes, you just sit there and you listen and you hope that you can understand. but we don't ask questions, right? And I think that what you've given us are some really interesting tools that are a lot more strategic than just, did you check the box, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, really the board and leadership can take, an extra kind of checking step here where, finance might be, all in the numbers, but when they take a step back, then they're able to do their jobs better when they're asked these questions.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. I love that approach. I think that's really smart because also it takes it out of just the clerical mindset. It puts everybody into a much more strategic mindset. Several times during this conversation of ours, you've brought up development,
Mhm.
right? And we need to blend those conversations more. So that's been brilliant. Really a lot of fun to have you on, Barbara. Barbara Enright, she comes to us from our friends over at YPTC, your part-time controller. She's a director, and you can learn more about the work at YPTC at yptc.com. Your part-time controller only works with nonprofits across this country. They have a really, really robust, I'm going to call it educational section where they have blog posts, they have trainings, they have webinars, they have episodes of the nonprofit show, and you can go on and there's no gatekeeper here. You can go on whether you're a client of theirs or not and really learn about the different things that are going on. As Barbara, you brought up today, it's so complex, but it doesn't need to be. I feel like it needs to be more strategic, these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, really been really interesting. Barbara's been with us as part of Nonprofit Power Week. And during this week, we've talked about the red flags that boards often miss, adopting AI that you can trust, and how you should be thinking about leading your organization through that, not just with finance, but with everything. We're going to be talking about when is it time to break up with your accounting partner and how do you know? And then what are the big questions about asking your software partners to do and how to work with you? Different topics, they all bleed into one another. It's been a fascinating week. We're just hitting the middle part. Barbara, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a lot of fun. We are here because we have these amazing partners that stand with us. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Third Sector Company, Your Part-Time Controller, and Martis, our newest sponsor, joining the nonprofit show. As we end this episode, and we end each and every episode, we leave with this message, and it goes like this: to stay well so you can do well.